Hey class, it is Mr. Crayton. So last week we focused on line design. So we used the art element of lines and then focused on the art principles of a focal point, and then contrast, using contrast to make that focal point clear, and then balancing out the space. Well, we're going to build upon that. And this week we're going to focus on the art element of space and then also shapes. So we're going to use shapes to create our design and figure out multiple ways to balance out the space to make an effective and useful design. So we're going to break this down and talk about composition and space. You will have to write notes. So in the back of your sketchbook, or if you don't have one, just grab a sheet of paper, and we're going to write down some terms throughout this presentation that will help you understand why these design ideas are so important. But then also, again, you'll be quizzed upon this and you'll be able to use your notes to help you with that. So anytime you see a red term, that's a term you write down, and you'll write down the definition behind it. So let's get this thing rolling. So right away, we're going to focus on what is the purpose of this presentation. Well, the purpose is space. So find that red word, which is space, and write down the definition. The purpose, how we use space to make artwork and design successful. So the purpose is how we use space to make the artwork and design successful. And then space is an art element, and the definition is areas around or between components of an artwork. So space is areas around or between components of an artwork. And think about the components in an artwork is what you're using. So if you're using like shapes or lines, or you have characters or anything that's in your design, the space around it, or the area around it, or the area in between those parts are the components. So anytime we make artwork, we always use art elements. So again, things like line, shape, color, value, space. And space helps us see what the focal focus of a design or artwork is. If you don't have space around your focal point, it can be hard to find. So if you look at both of these designs, the one bottom left and the one bottom right, which of these designs is easier to look at and why? Well, I'm assuming you're probably picking the design bottom right because there is space in between the shapes, and it gives us a little bit more room to breathe. It allows for us to see the shapes easier compared to the one on bottom left that's super cluttered and it's hard to focus on anything at all. So there are two types of space. Positive space is the first one. So write down that definition. Every design needs to have something for us to look at, and that's really an important part of design. We need something to look at. We need something to concentrate on. The design needs to have a purpose. So that is why we need positive space. Positive space is the occupied areas in a work of art. Again, positive space is the occupied areas in a work of art. So it's the space you're using. Anytime you use space, that's positive. So the positive space is the focal point in an artwork or design. The positive space is what you want us to focus on. So a lot of times in a drawing or a painting or in a design, that's what we call the subject matter. It's the subject you're looking at. So that image of the guy with the cigarette in his mouth, super famous artist. That image, bottom left, is his shape. That artist is going to be the subject matter. So he's the positive space. The image in the middle is Michael Jackson. So from a super long time ago, that is the positive space. In the image of the James Bond movie poster, so that really simple poster of his shirt with the bow and also the word Bond, that is positive space. So anytime you use space, that is positive. Next is negative. So negative space, think about it's a space you are not using. So positive space isn't positive without negative space around it to kind of give us something to balance it out with and something to look at. So negative space refers to the empty space around and between the subject matter or focal point. Negative space is the empty space around in between the subject matter or focal point. So negative space is usually dark in artwork or design, but it doesn't have to be. And negative space helps you see the subject matter better by providing contrast so you can see things. It also keeps things from being cluttered, so it gives your focal point on your focus some room to breathe. And the second term is contrast. So again, write down the words that are in red and the definition behind them. Contrast, we talked about this last week, and it is the difference in color or value. Again, contrast is the difference in color or value. So if you look at these designs in the artwork below too as well, Mona Lisa, of course, one of the most famous paintings of all time, so one of the top 4 most important and famous artworks. In that image, there is negative space. So Mona Lisa, the really bold shape of her, because it's really bold and easy to see, because a lot of her shape is black, so it provides contrast when it's next to the background, and the background of her painting is the negative space. For the image bottom left, if you look at the positive space, you'll probably see like a chalice or a cup, or almost like a vase. But if you look at the negative space, so the black area around it, you see that the 2 faces, so the forehead, the nose, mouth, and chin, just because that creates an optical illusion because of the shapes that are created when the positive meets the negative space. And then the blood diamond poster, well, of course, in this case, the focal point is black, so it's dark, and the background around it is light. So as long as you have contrast, you can easily tell the difference between the focal point, so the positive space, and the negative space around it. When you lose that contrast, though, we run into some problems like this. So you look at the negative space, look at that optical illusion that had the chalice, look at the blood diamond poster. When you lose that contrast, we run into issues. And so you do need to have high contrast to make sure your design is as clear as it can be. All right, so we got a few terms in this slide, but these are all super important. And these terms will be what you base your design around. So the first term is composition. Composition is going to be the combination and arrangement. So again, it's the combination and arrangement of elements to form a whole design. It is the combination and arrangement of elements to form a whole design. Composing an image means you are giving it balance and focus. So really, for your design, you're going to combine shapes and arrange them in a way that makes your design effective. And we're going to arrange them in 2 different ways. So the first one is symmetrical. Symmetrical is balanced around the center. So symmetrical is balanced around the center axis, aka the middle, with both sides being balanced evenly. Again, symmetrical is balanced around the center, so the middle, with both sides being balanced evenly. The other way to arrange your design will be asymmetrical. And asymmetrical is balanced evenly throughout the design. It's off-centered. So again, asymmetrical is balanced evenly throughout the design. It's off-centered. And if you're not sure if a design is symmetrical, meaning it's balanced around the middle, or if it's asymmetrical, meaning it's off-centered, the easiest way to find that out is to just put a line in the middle. If you were to take your hand or just use your eyes and make an imaginary line in the middle, you'll see if there is like more weight or space on one side than the other, and you'll also get to see if it's centered. So look at these images at the bottom, the poster for the really iconic movie of Jaws. So that image, if you were to put a line directly down the middle vertically, you will see that that poster is almost even on the left and on the right, and also it's that focal point center in the middle. So that is symmetrical. If you look at the Paul George ad, that's an old Paul George ad, by the way. So if you were to put a line down the middle of that one, there is more space being used bottom left than there is top left. Paul George's body leans more to the right than it does the left. So that space is not balanced evenly on both sides. And so it's also not completely centered, even though it's mostly in the middle. That is asymmetrical. And you look at that Avengers Endgame add to as well with those two characters, so Star Lord and Okoye. So from the Marvel movie franchise, if you put a line down the middle, Star Lord's character is not only bigger than Okoye, there's more words and numbers on the left side, so that's also asymmetrical. It is off center. There's more weight in shapes on the left than there is on the right. And so one reason why that happens is if you have multiple focal points, it is easier to make an asymmetrical composition. Also, if you want to make your composition a little more interesting, have a little more movement, it makes sense to make it asymmetrical instead of putting everything directly in the middle. And that's why you would choose that. So there are reasons as to why you would choose asymmetrical over symmetrical, and vice versa. So here's the deal. You don't got to write all this down. Just write down eye movement and visual hierarchy. So write down eye movement and visual hierarchy because that's going to play a factor into your design. And then I'll read the top section. So how do you make a good composition? Well, a focal point is key. A focal point to the viewer has something to focus on and there's a purpose. Remember, the focal point is what attracts your attention. It's what you want the viewer to see first. So one way to make a clear focal point is contrast. So you want contrast so your focal point is easy to see. And remember, contrast is the difference between colors or the difference between values. So if you have a design that has a bunch of bright colors for the focal point and dark colors for the background, that focal point will stand out. But another way to make your focal point clear and your composition good is to use size. If your focal point is large, it makes it so easy to see. So if you make it much larger than, say, other shapes in your design, it's going to stand out because your eye's attracted to what's different. Your eye's attracted to what's bold. Thinking about the line design, again, you got to design your eyes to seek things that are different and things that stand out. And so a good design will stand out. So eye movement is our next term. Eye movement is the path the viewer's eye takes around a work of art. Again, eye movement is the path the viewer's eye takes around a work of art. So a good artist or designer controls what a viewer sees using a focal point and contrast, size, and balance. And then an eye movement is a way to create a visual hierarchy. Eye movement meaning you're going to force us to see one thing, and then we kind of see the other things after. So it's the path we're taking, and a visual hierarchy is why. So a visual hierarchy is arranging elements to imply importance. Again, a visual hierarchy is arranging elements to imply importance. And what that means is if you want something to stand out and it's important, then you want to make it big, you want to make it bold, you want to use contrast so that way that stands out, and then we see the other things next. So then our eye follows those other minor things, those other smaller things next. So that image, bottom right, so that design that uses the teal and the blue and the cream colored background, that is a visual hierarchy. We see the giant circles, looks like the Target logo. We see those giant circles, and then our eye is led to the smaller ones because it's pointing us that way. That designer is leading us that way. And so that doesn't always happen, but it's a good way to balance out the space and make your design interesting by leading us to those minor things after that. And you can see that in the middle design too as well. A lot of logos, like the NFL logo on the left, does not do that because we just want to see that one thing. But for a design that uses space, we're looking at multiple things, and we want to use contrast and size to make sure our focal point stands out. So take a look at this. You don't have to write down any terms, but this shows you what a visual hierarchy is. So if you think about good composition is going to have balance. A good composition is going to have a clear focal point. It's also going to make us see what you want us to see. So based upon what a visual hierarchy is, you're forcing us to see one thing before we see another. So going back here, visual hierarchy is arranging elements to imply importance. So make us see that focal point before we see the background elements. And does this design use a visual hierarchy? Well, I would say yes, because those small circles, or not small circles, I meant those white circles, bottom left, are so bright compared to the background and creates contrast. So your eye's drawn to that automatically. Also, it's different than the rest of the design. Those are a bunch of circles. The other design has swirly lines, so it's different. And our eye sees that, and then we're led to all the colored lines. And that's what a visual hierarchy is. So you're forcing us to see one thing before we see another. And is this design balanced symmetrically? So meaning it is balanced around the middle, both sides are even, or is it asymmetrical, meaning it's off-centered? This one should be pretty easy to figure out. It's off-centered. The focal point to the bottom left, so it's not completely balanced evenly on both sides, even though it is balanced. So we're still using a majority of the space. So it's still balanced, but it's balanced in an asymmetrical way. Here's the deal. Here's your project. Your project, you will create a design that uses a visual hierarchy. So arranging elements to imply importance by using a clear focal point that uses size, contrast, and eye movement. You will then arrange your design in two different ways. So you will create two designs. Let me say that again. You will then arrange your focal point in two different ways. You're going to create two different designs. One will be symmetrical, centered, like the one bottom right. So you will create a symmetrical design, and the one bottom right is centered. You will also create an asymmetrical design, so one that is off-centered. If you look at the one that is bottom left, so that design, you can tell where the focal point is because it's the only thing that's bright in that design that's very dark and gray, and also the focal point is towards the top right. So it is different, it is asymmetrical, it is off-centered. And to make designing this easier, your design will be non-objective. So if you're not sure what non-objective means, I'm gonna break that down for you. But really your main focus is to create a design with a clear focal point, a design that is balanced, and a design that is balanced one of two ways, symmetrical and asymmetrical. So here's what non-objective means. It means not recognizable. So non-objective means not recognizable. The reason why you're creating a non-objective design is so we can really just focus on the idea of having a clear focal point and balancing out the image one of two ways. So the main focus isn't to say like, oh, I want this to look like Mickey Mouse. Sometimes trying to create a very clear focal point for in regards to making it look exactly like something can be complicated for this product. So we only want to focus on making it clear. So it's going to be non-objective. Non-objective. So the artwork or design does not represent or depict a person, place, or thing. Non-objective images are usually made up of color and shapes. If you don't have to worry about it representing something, you can just focus on how you put the design together using a visual hierarchy. And again, a visual hierarchy will have a clear focal point that uses size, contrast, and eye movement. If you look at the design bottom left, that does have balance, that does have eye movement, but it does not have a clear focal point. And we want to make sure that we do have that, like in all of our other designs. So, how do you put this thing together? Well, you do need to make sure your design is balanced. I'm going to break that down. So contrast, size, and eye movement makes a design and its focal point easy to see, but how do you make sure it's balanced? Well, if you're not sure where to put your shapes to create balance, imagine that your design is filled with 9 rectangles and fill them to to create balance. So this is what we call the rule of thirds. You don't need to write that down, but it is a tool to create balance. So using the rule of thirds gives your design order so that it is done on purpose. So lastly, you want to use craftsmanship. Craftsmanship is using skill, knowledge, and care. So you will be cutting out the shapes your design. For those of you who are working, in school, you will be cutting out shapes and gluing them down. So you want to cut out your shapes carefully. You want to glue them carefully. So that stuff matters in order to make your design as precise and as clean as possible. So that part's important. So using the skills you learn, using the knowledge so to create an effective and clear design, and then doing it carefully, that's all craftsmanship in a nutshell, and that determines too whether your design is successful or not, because then it looks more polished and finished. So here's what a complete symmetrical design looks like. If you look at this design that I made, this one has a clear focal point, and you can tell that because the big triangle in the middle is a different color, but it's also large, so it stands out. Design has high craftsmanship, meaning the cuts are clean. You don't see a bunch of glue all over the place. It was put together well, and the space is filled. But not only is the space filled, it's done in a symmetrical way. So the design is balanced around the middle, aka a symmetrical design, so it's centered. And then if you look at this, on the right side, you can tell that I have a shape in each section. It doesn't fill each section completely, but it does at least touch each section, so that way I know it's balanced. If you were to have, the entire top right section empty, that would not be balanced. So we do want to make sure that we are following that idea. If you have 9 rectangles, make sure you at least touch each section, even if you don't fill them completely. And then here's the asymmetrical one I designed. So look at this design here. Clear focal point, you can tell it's large, it's white, so it stands out. Also, it has high craftsmanship, so it's put together well. And then also it's off-centered. So one way to set up an asymmetrical design is if you're like, man, I'm not even sure where to place this. Well, then place your shape in one of the corners. So place it, bottom left, top left, bottom right, top right. Place it in one of those corners and then build outward from that corner. And then for sure it's going to be asymmetrical because you're starting in the corner already. And then the key is if you look at both these designs, they're simple. And what I mean by simple is these are just triangles. So you don't have to use complicated shapes as long as you're putting thought into what you're doing, as long as you have a clear focal point, as long as you use balance, and as long as one is symmetrical, aka centered, and asymmetrical, aka off-centered. So, as we wrap this thing up, make sure your design is not cluttered. We want to make sure that we can see what we're looking at. We want to make sure we can see the shapes. We want to make sure we can see the focal point. If you just toss a bunch of shapes on the paper, it becomes too cluttered and there's no space for it to breathe. So you need some negative space. Contrast is important to your design because we want to make sure we can see the focal point. Good design is clear. Good design communicates. So we want to be able to see what we're looking at. And then also, hopefully you should know the difference between a symmetrical design and then an asymmetrical design. So be aware of that because you have to remember, 2 designs. And then use that visual hierarchy to make this thing work. So make sure you have a clear focal point. If you make your focal point larger, bolder, a different color, it's going to stand out. So we'll see that before we see the other parts. Force us to see that focal point. That's a visual hierarchy. And then remember, you can use the rule of thirds. So if you were to make 9 rectangles, hit those sections. Make sure it's balanced, and that rule of thirds is going to help you there. So those are the tips to make sure your design is solid. So you are going to plan out in your sketchbook, just like we did before, one design that is symmetrical and then one design that is asymmetrical. So in your sketchbook, you're going to plan out 2 small designs. We call them thumbnail sketches because they're small sketches, so they can be small, as I just said, but you must have 2 designs, one that is symmetrical and one that is asymmetrical. And that is our non-objective product in a nutshell.